On the morning of the 15th of February, 1944, thousands of Allied soldiers stood in the freezing hills of central Italy and cheered as the sky filled with bombers. Wave after wave of flying fortresses came in over a single mountaintop and dropped more than 1,000 tons of bombs onto one building, the Abbey of Monte Cassino, a monastery that had stood on that hill for 1,400 years. When the smoke cleared, the summit was a smoking heap of rubble. Around 230 civilians who had been sheltering inside were dead. And there was just one problem. The enemy the bombers had come to destroy was not in the Abbey. There were no German soldiers inside. There never had been. This is the dark story of Monte Cassino, the sacred place an army destroyed to kill an enemy that wasn't there. For 4 months in 1944, this quiet Italian mountain became one of the deadliest battlefields of the entire war, a grinding horror that would cost tens of thousands of lives and level a monument older than almost anything in Europe. And at the heart of it sits one of the cruellest ironies of the whole conflict. The men who ordered the Abbey destroyed believed they were saving their own soldiers. Instead, they built the very fortress they were trying to remove. Within 2 days of the bombing, the enemy everyone feared would finally move into the ruins the bombers had made. To understand how it came to this, you have to start with a mountain and a road to Rome. If you're new here, this channel tells the stories of the places the war swallowed and the ordinary people caught inside them. If that's the kind of story you came for, a like and a subscribe genuinely help more than you'd think. In the autumn of 1943, the Allies had a plan that looked simple on a map. They had landed in southern Italy, knocked Mussolini's government out of the war, and now they meant to march north up the leg of Italy and take Rome. Rome was the prize, the first Axis capital to fall, a victory the whole world would see. But between the Allied armies and Rome lay a problem the map did not show: mountains. Central Italy is a spine of steep, cold, rocky peaks and fast rivers, and the Germans had no intention of giving it up. Their commander in Italy, Field Marshal Kesselring, had decided to make the Allies pay for every single mile. So the Germans built a wall across the whole width of Italy. Not a wall of stone, but a belt of fortifications dug into the mountains, bunkers, machine gun nests, minefields, and artillery, sited to cover every road and valley. They called it the Gustav Line. And the hinge of the whole thing, the strongest point on the strongest line, was a place called Cassino. Here is why Cassino mattered so much. The main road to Rome, Highway 6, ran through a valley right beneath it. Any army heading for Rome had to pass through that valley, and looming over it on a mountain some 1,700 feet high stood the Abbey of Monte Cassino. Whoever held that height could see for miles in every direction, every road, every field, every soldier trying to move below. It was, quite simply, the most valuable piece of high ground in Italy. But the Abbey was not just a piece of high ground, it was one of the most important religious sites in the Western world. 1,400 years earlier, around the year 529, a monk named Benedict had climbed this hill and founded a monastery here, the very first of its kind. From this mountain, the Benedictine order spread across Europe, and Monte Cassino became a birthplace of Western monasticism, a treasure house of books and art and learning that had survived earthquakes, sackings, and the fall of Rome itself. Its walls were 10 feet thick. Its library held tens of thousands of irreplaceable volumes, papal documents centuries old, and paintings by some of the greatest masters who ever lived. It was, to the people of Italy and to millions of Catholics around the world, something close to holy ground, a place that had stood, calm and permanent, through 15 centuries of war and disaster. In 1944, that permanence was about to end. The timing could not have been worse for the men who had to attack it. Winter had come to the mountains, freezing rain, sleet, mud that swallowed boots and trucks and guns whole. The rivers ran high and cold. The slopes were bare rock and thin soil with almost no cover. And the Germans held the high ground everywhere, looking down. For a soldier at the bottom, it meant that every move was watched, and every watched move could bring down shell fire within minutes. The Allies had walked into the hardest kind of fighting there is, uphill in winter, against a prepared enemy who could see them coming. And at the top of it all sat the Abbey, pale and silent, seeming to stare down at every man in the valley. The first attempts to break through began in January 1944, and they were a catalogue of misery. On the left, American soldiers of the 36th Division were ordered to cross a river called the Rapido right in front of the German guns. It was a slaughter. The Germans had every yard of that river zeroed in. Men climbed into small boats in the dark and were blown apart in the water. Those who reached the far bank were pinned down and cut to pieces. In 2 days, the division was shattered for almost nothing. The Rapido crossing became one of the worst disasters suffered by American troops in the entire war, and the survivors never forgot it or forgave it. Elsewhere, the story was the same. French colonial troops fought their way through the northern mountains with tremendous courage and were ground down. American divisions threw themselves at the heights around the Abbey again and again, taking hill after hill at appalling cost, clawing up bare rock under machine gun fire, only to be stopped just short of the summit every time. By the end of January, the assaults on Monte Cassino had already killed some 11,000 men. 2 of the leading American divisions had lost most of their fighting strength, and still the mountain held. The cruellest part was how close they came. At one point, American troops fought their way to within a few hundred yards of the Abbey walls, close enough for the monks to watch German and American patrols firing at each other on the slopes, and could get no further. A bare, rocky hump just above the monastery, marked on the maps only as point 593, changed hands again and again in hand-to-hand fighting and became a graveyard. Every foot of that mountain had to be bought with blood, and there was never quite enough blood to buy the last few feet to the top. There was another reason the pressure kept rising. Far behind the German line, the Allies had landed a whole army at a beach called Anzio, hoping to race inland and force the Germans to give up Cassino without a fight. But the Anzio landing had stalled almost at once, trapped on its own beachhead. Now 2 Allied armies were stuck, one below Cassino, one at Anzio, and both were bleeding. The generals needed a breakthrough, and they needed it fast. All eyes turned back to the mountain and the Abbey on top of it. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what those months did to the men. This was not clean fighting. It was weeks of living in the open on a freezing mountain, in holes scraped out of rock and mud, unable to light a fire, unable to move by day. Trench foot and frostbite and sickness took as many men as bullets did. Bodies could not be recovered and lay where they fell. And over all of it, day and night, hung the feeling of being watched. The soldiers were certain that German eyes were looking down on them from the one place that towered over everything, the Abbey. Every time a shell landed on them out of a clear sky, that certainty grew. They came to hate the building on the hill with a deep, bitter hatred. It sat up there, pale and untouched, while they died in the mud beneath it. It became, in their minds, the eye of the enemy, the thing that saw them and killed them. Here is the tragedy hiding inside that hatred. The soldiers were right that they were being watched. They were wrong about where the watchers were. The Germans did have superb observation over the valley, but from positions dug into the slopes and crags around the Abbey, not from the Abbey itself. To a freezing, terrified man in a foxhole, though, that distinction meant nothing. The tallest thing for miles was the monastery, and it seemed obvious that death was coming from its windows. No one down in the mud could prove otherwise. And a belief held by thousands of suffering men, repeated over and over up the chain of command, begins to harden into fact. By early February, whole units had been reduced to a fraction of their strength, and men were being pulled out of the line with what the army politely called combat fatigue. Others simply broke or shot themselves in the foot to escape the front. The Italian campaign was quietly producing psychiatric casualties on a scale the army did not like to discuss. These were not cowards. They were men used up by a kind of war that seemed to have no end. Into this exhausted, desperate mood came fresh troops and a new commander carrying a new idea. If the mountain could not be taken while the Abbey stood, then perhaps the Abbey should not stand. Now we come to the thing the men in the mud did not know, the thing that turns this from a tragedy into something harder to forgive. The truth about the Abbey of Monte Cassino. The Germans were not stupid. They knew exactly how valuable that hilltop was, and they knew exactly how sacred the building on it was. And early in the fighting, the German command made a decision that, for once, was on the side of history. They agreed not to occupy the Abbey itself. Their troops would hold the mountain, the slopes, the ridges, the caves, everything around it, but they would keep their soldiers out of the monastery and out of a protected zone around it. A German general in the sector, Friedrich von Senger und Etterlin, a devout Catholic, took this seriously, and German military police were posted to make sure no soldier crossed the line into the Abbey grounds. It was not sentiment alone. The Germans also knew that a great crime against a holy place would be a gift to Allied propaganda. But whatever the reason, the result was real. The Abbey was left alone. For months, the monks lived on inside their walls, while the war crept up the mountain toward them. From the windows, they could watch patrols moving on the slopes, could hear the guns growing closer, could see the flashes in the dark. One of them, a monk named Martino Matronola, kept a careful record of those days and would later testify to what he had seen with his own eyes, that German soldiers did not enter the Abbey. But no diary kept by a monk on a mountaintop could reach the frightened men in the valley below. There is more. Months before the battle reached the mountain, 2 German officers had driven up the winding road to the Abbey with an offer. The war was coming, they warned the monks, and the treasures of Monte Cassino, the library, the archives, the paintings, would not survive it. They proposed to move everything to safety in Rome. And so, through the autumn of 1943, in more than 100 truckloads, the German army helped carry the Abbey's treasures down the mountain and away to the Vatican. Tens of thousands of ancient books, priceless works by Titian and Raphael and others, saved from the destruction to come. It was not a perfectly clean act. Some crates were quietly diverted into German hands. But the heart of Monte Cassino's 14 centuries of learning was carried out to safety before a single Allied bomb fell. So when the bombers came, this is what was actually inside the Abbey. Not an enemy garrison. An old man, the abbot, Gregorio di Amare, nearly 80 years old, and a small handful of monks who had refused to abandon their home, and with them, huddled inside the ancient building for shelter from the battle raging outside, were hundreds of terrified Italian civilians, refugees from the ruined town below, women, children, the old, the sick, the wounded. They had climbed to the monastery because, for 1,400 years, it had been the one safe place on the mountain. They believed its walls would protect them. They did not know that far below, the building sheltering them had already been marked for destruction. None of this was visible from the valley floor. The men freezing in their foxholes could not see an old abbot at prayer, or frightened families in the crypt, or the empty rooms where the treasures had been. They could only see the great pale building on the skyline and feel the shells landing around them and draw the obvious, terrible conclusion. From below, the Abbey looked exactly like what they feared it was, and the gap between what the soldiers believed and what was true was about to be closed in the worst way imaginable, not by finding out the truth, but by acting on the lie. The push to destroy the Abbey came from the men who had to take the mountain. A New Zealand general named Bernard Freyberg, whose troops were next to be thrown at Monte Cassino, became convinced that his men could not succeed while the monastery stood over them. He demanded it be bombed. Behind him stood other officers who agreed, and behind them the weight of thousands of soldiers who were sure the building was killing them. Not everyone agreed. The American General Mark Clark, who commanded the army in that sector, did not believe the Germans were in the Abbey, and he did not want to destroy it. He argued that bombing a monastery of that importance would be a shameful act, and, with cold foresight, he warned that even if the Germans were not in the building now, they would certainly move into the rubble the moment it was flattened. He was overruled. The final decision fell to the overall commander, the British General Harold Alexander, who, under pressure from Freyberg and from Churchill himself demanding action, gave the order to bomb. Clark was so uneasy that he insisted the order be put in writing so that the destruction of Monte Cassino would not be remembered as his decision. And what was the evidence that the Abbey had to die? It was thin, and it has not aged well. On reconnaissance flights over the mountain, officers reported seeing a radio antenna and washing hanging on a line in a courtyard, and figures they took for German soldiers. From that, an intelligence report concluded that the monastery was full of Germans and had to be destroyed. In truth, the evidence was the ordinary life of an abbey still lived in by monks and crowded with refugees. But by now, no one wanted to hear that. The soldiers wanted the building gone. The generals wanted a breakthrough. The belief that the Abbey was a nest of Germans had become too useful and too widely held to question. There is a bitter footnote to the decision. Only weeks earlier, the Allied Supreme Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, had issued a formal order that the historic monuments of Italy were to be respected and spared wherever the fighting allowed. Monte Cassino was exactly the kind of treasure that order was meant to protect. Everyone in the chain of command knew it. They destroyed it anyway, telling themselves that military necessity left them no choice. Whether it truly did is a question that has never stopped being argued. What is certain is that the necessity they believed in rested on a mistake. There was one last chance to spare the people inside. On the 14th of February, the day before the raid, Allied artillery fired shells filled with leaflets over the mountain, warning that the Abbey was about to be bombed and telling everyone to get out. But it was almost cruelty dressed up as warning. There was no ceasefire, no safe route down, no time. When the abbot was shown one of the leaflets, a German officer with him dismissed it as propaganda, and no proper evacuation was arranged. Hundreds of civilians were still inside the walls, with nowhere to go and no way to leave, when the sun rose on the 15th of February. And in the valley, the gunners and the soldiers looked up at the mountain and waited for the planes. The bombing began in the middle of the morning. First came the heavy bombers, scores of four-engined flying fortresses, the biggest the Allies had, droning in over the mountain in wave after wave. Then the medium bombers. In all, more than 200 aircraft dropped over 1,000 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs onto a single hilltop building, while the artillery pounded it in between the runs. From the valley, the soldiers watched the summit of Monte Cassino disappear inside a churning cloud of smoke and dust and fire. Many of them cheered. After months of misery beneath it, they were watching the hated eye of the enemy destroyed at last. The noise reached them a moment after the sight, a rolling thunder that shook the ground for miles. Great slabs of ancient wall lifted into the air and fell back. The basilica, with its frescoes and its organ and its centuries of carved stone, simply ceased to exist. Fires took hold in the wreckage. For hours the mountaintop burned, wrapped in smoke so thick that from the valley the Abbey seemed to have been rubbed clean off the sky. Inside, it was the end of the world. The abbot and a few monks had gone down into the deepest vaults of the monastery, into the ancient crypt, and there in the dark they survived, praying as the building came down on top of them. The refugees were not so lucky. When the bombs stopped and the dust began to settle, around 230 civilians, the people who had climbed to the Abbey because they thought it was safe, lay dead in the ruins, women and children among them. The monastery that had stood for 1,400 years, that had survived the fall of Rome, was a shattered heap of broken stone open to the sky. 2 days later, the monks who had lived went out. At dawn on the 17th of February, the aged abbot led the survivors, the handful of monks, and whatever civilians could still walk, out of the ruins and down the mule track toward the German lines, reciting the rosary as they went, an old man in his robes picking his way down a mountain of rubble. Behind them, they left their home in pieces. One monk, it is said, could not bear to go and slipped back into the ruins. Later, German soldiers who glimpsed him wandering among the broken stones took him for a ghost, and after a while he was never seen again. And now came the twist that turns the whole thing into a nightmare. Everything the bombing was meant to prevent, it caused. Before the raid, the Germans had kept their word and stayed out of the Abbey. After the raid, that agreement was dead, and the Germans looked at what the Allies had made and could hardly believe their luck. Because a great intact building is actually a poor fortress, it can be seen into and shelled, and it burns. But a mountain of thick tumbled rubble, full of cellars and craters and broken walls, 10 feet thick, that is one of the strongest defensive positions on Earth. Within 2 days, the elite German paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Division, men the Allies called the Green Devils, moved into the ruins and turned them into exactly that. A fortress. The very next assault, launched by exhausted Allied troops right after the bombing, ran straight into those ruins and was thrown back with terrible losses. The Allies had spent the lives of hundreds of civilians and a 1,400-year-old abbey to make their own task harder, and the disaster did not stay on the battlefield. The Germans made sure the world heard about it. The old abbot was taken to a radio station in Rome and made to describe, weeping, the destruction of his monastery. The enemy's propaganda machine spread the story everywhere. Look at the Allies, the great liberators, who bombed churches and monasteries to rubble. One horrified onlooker said it was as if someone had bombed Westminster Abbey. In a single morning, the Allies had killed innocent people, destroyed a masterpiece, strengthened the enemy, and handed him a propaganda victory. It is remembered, still, as one of the worst blunders of the war. 10 days after the bombing, Allied intelligence officers quietly confirmed the truth. No German troops had been inside the Abbey before it was destroyed. The report was filed away. No public correction was ever made. If this story is landing on you the way it landed on us while we researched it, take a moment to subscribe. We go into places like this every single video, and we think the ones still to come are the best we've done. The bombing did not end the battle, it prolonged it. For 3 more months, the ruins of Monte Cassino held, and the Allies kept coming and kept dying. In March, they tried again, this time flattening the town of Cassino itself under another storm of bombs, more than 1,000 tons of them, turning the streets into a moonscape of craters and rubble. And once again, the plan backfired. The craters and the wreckage stopped the Allied tanks and gave the German defenders perfect cover, and the rain came down and turned everything to a swamp. Another attack ground to a halt in the mud and the ruins, at yet another fearful cost. By the spring of 1944, Monte Cassino had become a byword for futile slaughter, the Western War's answer to the horror of the trenches. 4 times the Allies assaulted this line, 3 times they were stopped. The mountain had swallowed division after division, nation after nation, American, British, French, Indian, New Zealander, and given almost nothing back. The men who finally took it were the Poles. The soldiers of the Polish II Corps had one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire war. They had lost their country twice over, invaded by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in the same month of 1939. And many of them had survived Soviet prison camps before making an epic journey across half the world to keep fighting. They hated the Germans with a cold, personal hatred, and their commander, Vladislav Anders, told them that here, on this mountain, was their chance. In May 1944, in the Great Final Offensive, the Poles were handed the task that had broken everyone else: take the summit and the ruins of the Abbey. Their first attack, launched in the 2nd week of May, ran into the same wall of fire that had stopped every army before them and was driven back with dreadful losses along ridgelines the Poles came to know by grim nicknames. They regrouped, buried their dead, and went again. The cost was horrific. The Poles climbed into the same murderous ground where so many had already died, into machine gun fire and artillery and the rubble the paratroopers had made their fortress. They were cut down in waves, but this time, with the German line finally cracking all along the front, they held on. On the 18th of May, 1944, a Polish patrol reached the top of Monte Cassino and raised the red and white flag of Poland over the broken stones of the Abbey. The defenders were gone, slipped away in the night to the next line back, leaving behind only a small group of wounded men too badly hurt to move. After 4 months, the question Monte Cassino leaves you with is how much of what we destroy out of fear was ever really a threat at all, and how often the thing we dread most is the thing our own fear calls into being. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone and subscribe if you haven't yet. We have more places like Monte Cassino coming, every one of them a corner of the war the rest of the internet forgot.